Have you ever wondered who exactly you are? We are more than our name, our job title, or perhaps how we're viewed in our personal lives. Whatever part of the world you're listening to this podcast from, today's episode is going to stretch your mind like it did mine as we expand our field of view from our individual schools or workplaces to our cities to go far outside of where we operate on a day-to-day basis to think on a different level than we usually think about ourselves or those around us. We're going to use a brilliant article written by author and former National Geographic Learning Consultant André Hedlund called Learning Cosmos, a voyage into the learner's universe to help us take our imaginations on a trip where we'll consider the multitude of principles, theories, and frameworks that address learning and compare them to the expanding universe, different spheres, each one influencing the others. Today, André will look at neuroscience and psychology and bring together principles about cognition, emotion, attitudes and beliefs, motivation, learning design, and context. Many of the topics we've been talking about on this podcast for the past 3 years into an illustration that resembles the universe so we can see how we fit into our world from a different point of view. And André's hope is that this learning cosmos angle can help students, teachers, schools, families, and policymakers admire and reflect on the amazing universe surrounding our learners. Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast for episode number 205. I'm Andrea Samadi, author and educator from Toronto, Canada, now in Arizona, and today's guest is an expert in education, the science of learning, neuroscience, psychology, pedagogy, and the methodology behind how we learn. If you're interested in neuroscience and learning, which I'm sure you are if you've been tuning into our podcast, I know this episode will expand your thinking like it did mine as we hear from André's perspective why neuroscience alone cannot tell us how we learn. We must look at psychology and education for these answers. But next, he takes it a step further with an empowering, mind-boggling thought. Imagine this, if you will. The cosmos is within us. We are all made of star stuff. We're a way for the universe to know itself. Astrophysicist Carl Sagan said that, and this quote opens up André's article. And it took me back to the day I was first introduced to this topic of neuroscience before I knew how the brain and learning were connected. I was mind-boggled. I had many questions. How in the earth, pun intended, is our learning connected to the cosmos? Wait, what is the cosmos again? It's been a while since I studied the planets, even though I did teach 9th grade science for a semester, but my knowledge here is limited as I never really got into Star Trek or those out of space shows. So what does it mean when he says the cosmos is within us? I've been wrapped up in the brain and neuroscience for the past few years, and I had to look up what exactly this means. The funny part of researching and coming up with some questions for André to help us to dive deeper into this topic was that I shared on LinkedIn that I was looking forward to our interview as I spent Friday and Saturday night reading André's new book, The Owl Factor, Reframing Your Teaching Philosophy. And Greg Link, who I've mentioned before on this podcast, who took Stephen Covey's 7 Habits book to great heights, commented on the post and got me to think even harder about the questions I was going to come up with. I don't think there are any accidents in life, and when André caught Greg's attention, I felt like I'd better dive deep into this topic and see if we can all reframe our teaching philosophies with this new perspective. Let's meet André Hedlund and take this voyage into the learner's universe. Welcome, André, all the way from Brazil. And André, we've got a good number of listeners from Brazil. And after reading your article, it really made sense to me, showing how someone in another country can hold so much passion for this topic and look at something like learning from a different angle. So thank you so much for contacting me and sharing your work with all of us today to look at learning this new way.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. It's such a pleasure for me to be here, actually, because, as you can tell, I'm passionate about learning and teaching, and I feel like I have a lot to contribute, I think, especially after my master's and, being exposed to so many different theories and principles about how we learn, how the brain works, how the mind works, and I'm happy to share.
Well, thank you so much, and your passion absolutely shines through. It's undeniable, which is what made me,
Great.
fast track and read your book and get everything done because I saw how your passion was shining through. I'm like, let's get Andre on here and dive into this.
Yeah,
And so Andre, this podcast is the Neuroscience Meets Social Emotional Learning podcast, as you know. And I
sure.
clearly remember when I made that neuroscience SEL connection. How in the earth did you make the connection with learning and the cosmos?
Well, I'm a geek, so let's start there, right?
Sure.
I've always loved science fiction, and I've always been fascinated, really, by how the universe works and science in general. I always wanted to understand how things work, and I remember that when I was studying in the UK at the University of Bristol. I had a lot of literature to go through. I had a lot of books and papers about learning. And I remember thinking, how cool, how wonderful would it be for, educators to have access to the literature that I have here, the stuff that I'm studying here. And then a couple of years, maybe 1 year after, when I was back in Brazil, I felt like, okay, but how can I make it available in I don't know, maybe an easier way, something that teachers can relate to. And at the time, I was reading Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, the illustrated version, and I think it was a master when it came to analogies and explaining very complex things using metaphors and concrete examples. And so that's probably how the analogy came to me first. I said, well, I want to analyze learning from different perspectives, different spheres of influence. And I think that's very similar to how we look at the universe, because we can focus on the planet, we can focus on the solar system, for example, or we can even go further to the intergalactic space, and we can look from the perspective of a whole galaxy or even more galaxies together, a cluster of galaxies. And the more we travel, the more we explore different spheres, the more we realize how tiny we are, and how much more we have to learn. And then I think that's how it came to me. I said, well, I think this fits. I think this is actually a very good match, because the universe is intrinsically complicated and fascinating. And so is learning. I think learning has so many different layers and levels that I think we end up oversimplifying the learning process, but we need to have a more holistic view of how learning takes place. And that's how the learning cosmos was born, I think.
Well, this is great. I love it. And it's definitely made me think a lot because I did not watch those out of space shows. Were you into Star Trek and all that back?
Oh, yeah, I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, even more Star Wars, actually. I really like Star Wars. Yeah. I have, Yoda t-shirt and all of that. Yeah.
What was it about those shows? Because I did not get into that. What was it that drew you in?
Yeah, I think for me, it was the possibility of, changing my reality, or thinking about potential worlds or universes that are very different from the one I'm living in, right? And since I wanted to explore my creativity, I guess I wanted to understand other people's reality, and that felt like a very good way to do it. Because when you watch Star Trek or Star Wars or any science fiction movie, or when you read a book, everything is very, very different. You have other beings from different planets, and they have spaceships, and they have different types of weapons, and the types of government. Everything is very, very different. The animals, the food that they have, and I was always fascinated. I always wanted to understand culture, and I felt like those sci-fi movies, they brought a whole new level of different culture, right, to me. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a geek, like I said. It's just interesting to think of different things from a very different perspective. And sci-fi can do that for us, right?
Yeah, I love that when you step
Yeah.
back and look at something from a different angle, you see so much. And I had honestly never looked at learning from this angle. And it
Yeah.
made me think. I went back and there was this one interview I did with this guy called Nick Halleck. And he actually went out into space as a civilian. And he also
Oh,
went to the bottom of the ocean and sat on the Titanic. And in his interview, he's got this video that kind of narrows in on him as a young kid. He's in his home, and then it
yeah.
goes out, it pans out, and made me think of it. I want to see if I can put a clip in this because it showed that he was ill when he was a young boy, and he was stuck in his house, and he was studying these encyclopedias to expand his mind. And then the video pans out all the way from watching him in the window of his home all the way into the vast part of the universe. And it just
Wow.
reminded me of this, like we're going to take a voyage now. And I think, well, look at the voyage Nick Halleck took in those
Yeah.
encyclopedias. That's kind of like what he was doing as a kid. And then as an adult, he lived it out, with all, he made this list of things he wanted to do. And so it kind of reminded me of that,
Nice.
this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. There's this, I think what you mentioned is really important, Andrea, because I really like the idea of exploring, so this idea of being an astronaut, for example, or a diver, or, a marine explorer, or whatever you want to call them. Somebody who goes into, the unknown, let's say, and tries to identify similarities, and, synthesize things. And until very recently, we didn't even know much about the universe, our own cosmos, right? It's been maybe a couple of hundreds of years since we, invented the telescope, and then we could actually look up, in the sky, and see different planets, and even different galaxies and things like that, and started wondering. So I like this idea very much, that there's much more for us to unravel. Carl Sagan used to say that, there's always something to be known, something to be discovered. And I think that's fascinating.
yeah, that just reminds me, like we could keep going on tangents away from the questions that I've crafted for you here, but it just
Yeah.
reminds me as we're learning and as I'm working on these podcast episodes, I realize how little I know, and yours, it really stumped me. Like if it took me a while to get back to you, it was because I don't know this topic at all. And I thought, what questions could I ask him? So it took me Friday and Saturday night really thinking about this. And so that's why I want to make sure that we go slow and we take our time with the connections needed because I don't have them.
Excellent.
And
Yeah.
so I know, that you're going to fill me in on this, but where do we begin? What is the
Yeah.
science of learning? What should we all know about genetics, epigenetics for
Yeah.
ourselves, our children, and our students? And what does this mean for the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great question. The science of learning is this transdisciplinary area that looks at learning from multiple perspectives, especially from cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and other areas, other branches of psychology as well, social psychology, developmental psychology, the psychology of individual differences. And so that means that it's not just one area, investigating what is out there about learning. And I like that because it makes it more, I don't know, solid, let's say. So the knowledge that we can get from the science of learning, it's kind of checked by other people from different areas. And I like that because it gives it more strength in a way. And I feel like every teacher should know more about the science of learning, because or educator, and even anyone interested in learning, for that matter, because we're all learners. We're lifelong learners. We're learning all the time. We should know how the brain works, even if only the basic principles, I think, because maybe we don't want to be experts in that. We want to understand, for example, that the brain is highly plastic. We're always making connections. We're creating new synapses as we talk right now, we are changing our brain constantly. But also there's the emotional side that you discussed so well, the social and emotional learning part. We also have to understand that. So neuroscience alone doesn't hold all the answers. And I feel like a lot of people are pushing that agenda. Like, there's something based on neuroscience and it's going to revolutionize the world, but you have to check with the other fields as well, right? That's very important. And what should we know about epigenetics and genetics? And I think Howard Gardner, who's probably somebody very popular among your listeners, he's the one who talked about multiple intelligences. And even though he's gone back and revised his theory, but anyway, he says that he believes that everybody in education should know something about how the brain works, how the mind works, and how genetics works, because we know from research, and I think one of the big references there is Robert Plomin, who's an American psychologist, and he's written many books. One of his most popular books is Blueprint, I think. And he says that most of what, at least 50% of who we are, the things we are capable of, the things we like, everything about us, that's genetic, right? And if that's genetic, we have to understand that there are some things we can do about that, and there are some things that we cannot do, unless we start editing, our genome with technology that exists, like CRISPR, for example. We can actually edit genes nowadays. But if we understand that there's much we can do on the other side of the spectrum, the other 50%, and that has to do with upbringing and psychology, for example, and references that you might have, and influences, the things that happen to you, behavior, and all of that. So that means that we can focus on those things, right? We can learn about those things, how those things may influence who we are. And then I think we can definitely help our learners and ourselves become better learners, more effective learners. And that's what I would say to parents and anyone who wants to understand how learning takes place. First, remember that a lot of it is out of your hands because it's genetic, And of course, you can influence turning on and off the genes because of the environment, sure. But many things are just out of your hands, right? But then there are things you can learn that deal with psychology and social psychology, cognitive psychology, and it has to do with how you inspire or encourage or promote certain things in the learning environment, and those things will have an impact on learning, right? So learn that, and then start from there, and then you can go on, right?
Well, what I liked in your article is obviously we're looking at something from a different perspective, but also the fact that you use diagrams and frameworks as a key component to break this down. And
Yes.
I mentioned Greg Link in the backstory when I was
Yep.
recording how he commented on LinkedIn, and it just made me remember something when I went to ask him for some advice when I was putting some of my books out into the world. He said, "Are the concepts in your book clear, like Covey's 7 Habits?" He's like, "What are the concepts that you want to teach?" And I thought about it, and it made me really think about the framework and what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. And I never forgot that. And that's why we picked the 6 SEL competencies to launch this podcast. It was almost like that was the framework, pick these 6 competencies. So how did you take all the theories and frameworks connected to learning? Like everyone that I've ever known that's connected to learning, you've mentioned their research. And then
Yeah.
how did you compare it to the cosmos? So how did you even get there?
Yeah, that was a very hard process. I have to be honest about that. So if you go to my blog, you will see that at some point I was actually drawing the concentric circles on a wall. I have a
Wow.
huge wall, and I painted it black, like a blackboard wall. And then I got some chalk and I started drawing there.
That's
Because
awesome.
I got a lot of different, when I started, I had probably a Post-it, and I started sketching something, and I said, this is too small. Then I got an A4 sheet of paper, and I started drawing a couple of things. That's small, I need something bigger. And then I ended up doing that on the wall. But it was really a process of really going back to my the literature that I had read for my master's, and the things that I was studying and talking about in different webinars. And then I realized that we normally just talk about cognition. So when we're teachers, educators, and how we assess our students' performance, it's really about attention and memory, if we think about it. So how much they were able to pay attention, how much they memorized, and how much they were able to express, maybe there was a test or something. And that's really attention and memory. And that's the first, you have the self, which is the core sphere, because, our students have to be aware. It's related to self-awareness, for example, in the six realms or competencies of self. And then from self, you go to cognition, because cognition is probably one of the most important things when it comes to learning, because if there's no attention and memory, and those are cognitive processes, there's no learning. We need to pay attention to stimuli and then memorize those things, hold those things in our working memory, and then consolidate as long-term memory. So those are essential, like pretty much the conditions that we have on planet Earth for life to thrive, right? Without those things, there's no life, basically. So without those aspects of cognition, there's no learning. But then you move on. And nowadays, in recent educational debates, we've been talking more and more about how emotions are very important, and they're a very important part of the process, right? So the emotional sphere is the one that comes next, because we have many people talking about emotions. And then I thought maybe this has a lot to do with the climate. Think about a planet and all of the intricacies and everything that has to do with the climate. And now people are talking about global warming, for example. And then, so if the climate is not right, also, this is going to affect life as well, right? And then I said, so this, when I thought about those things, for some reason, everything kind of made sense in my brain. I was, sketching. And then, I went further. Okay, so what's the next one? And then I started thinking about, okay, but so students, they have certain attitudes and beliefs about learning. They will, sometimes they believe that they can learn well. Sometimes they actually think that their capacity is limited by something, and that will have an impact on how they learn. And then I started thinking about growth mindset and metacognition, for example, and self-efficacy. That's also related to self in a way. It's there. And then I started moving away from the student in the center. So basically, I started thinking about motivation. And that's something that comes from the student, because we have intrinsic motivation, but we also have extrinsic motivation. So we have teachers and educators who can do that, who can motivate their students. And then I went further, learning design, structure, policy, and all of that, because I felt like there are things that are very distant from our own reality. They're, like policy making, for example, that they're top-down processes, but they will have an influence on what we do in the classroom. So standardized testing, for example, high-stakes testing, that's policy, and it comes all the way from, it's like the galaxy level. It's so far away, but it's going to determine the things that we do in the classroom to get our students to pass the tests, and then maybe get funding for our school, depending on their performance, right? So I think we have to be aware of this cosmos. It's complex. There's so many different layers, but I invite people to explore little by little, just like an astronaut. So you go from this level to the next, and so on. And then maybe after a couple of months or a year, maybe a year after, you're very familiar with all of those theories. And then this will have a positive impact on your practice, right?
There's a lot to what you just said, and I'll put
Yeah,
that planetary level diagram in the show notes where you go from self to cognitive to emotional. Each level has so many educational theories and frameworks within it. I
yeah,
was just blown away with this when I saw it, and I was carrying your article around the whole weekend and making notes. And now that I
it's
see
great.
your process, I can imagine your chalkboard. That would be really cool because I've seen on your website you've got post-it notes, and when you come in and work with schools, you've got
Yep.
these great ideas, and that's what I've been doing in this office. I've got big posters all over the wall with post-its, and you write
Yeah.
ideas and you think, and you tapped into pretty much, I feel like, everything we've been talking about on this podcast, just from this different angle. And as you were just talking, I was thinking about, the planet and how
Yeah.
we're all connected and how there's a lot to it. And then you talked about policy, and then I thought, oh, how do we make change in our
Yes.
educational system? It seems so far out there, right? So far out there. But do you
Definitely.
think, how does change happen with all of this?
Yeah, that's a tough question, I think. But if you think about policy has to do with the environment, let's say the context of planets, So so I actually have a mug here with the Learning Cosmos,
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
I
That's
have a
cool.
mug and I have the magazine. So this is the magazine.
Oh,
So New
wonderful.
Routes magazine, and then when you look at the illustration and you see the different layers and everything, and you will see that context and resources. That's the outer most layer that is really far, and that's where you get policy. And the reason why our planet has life and our planet is thriving, let's say, is because of our position in the solar system, the distance from the sun, uh, plankton and bacteria and so many other things. And if we change that position, if it was, I don't know, slightly closer to the sun, like Venus, for example, there wouldn't be any life on this planet. Like there's no life in Venus, as far as we know, right? And I think that's what policy can do. It can kind of put the planet closer or further from the sun, right? So because it's the environment that surrounds the planet. But then once you are locked in a good position, you are where you should be, the things that we do on the planet, inside the planet, will count a lot as well. Because policy will only basically make sure will put us somewhere in the solar system, and then we're going to revolve around a sun, a star, and we're going to interact with other planets. But I think that the stuff that we do inside is very important. And if we understand how learning takes place from a cognitive emotional perspective, and we can use that despite what policy tells us to do, right? I think we can make change, right? But we can also pressure our, politicians, for example, for better practices. And I think one of the things that we should be doing and we don't do, and this is especially true in Brazil, is that we don't have experts, people who actually know about education and how education should work, in positions in the government where they can make decisions and say, hey, this is not the best way to go about this. So we have people who are politicians, maybe, who don't know anything about education, and they don't have, their staff doesn't know much about education. And I think that's one of my biggest concerns. We need to get people who understand those things to make policy, and in a way that will benefit everyone. But we have, for example, everywhere in the world, we have a major obstacle, I think, and that's standardized testing. And so one of the things about standardized testing is that you're treating every student as if they were exactly the same planet, and they're different planets. And then I feel like one of the things we can do is, even if we have to take those tests, if we have to apply them, the students have to take them, we also have to include stuff that will basically nurture or promote how different they are. So individualize them. So we have to work with portfolios, for example. We have to work with differentiation, personalization, and all of that. And that's part of the learning cosmos. So I think there are different levels. We can work on the planetary level, trying to make our students better learners, more efficient learners. And we can also work at the intergalactic level and try to pressure for our governments for change, for effective change, so that maybe we don't have to fight against all the odds all the time, so that we can make our students learn more effectively, right?
True. And is all I could think about when you were talking was not having people running our educational decisions with a background in education. Because
Yeah.
I remember seeing something years ago where Howard Gardner was perhaps going to run for one of the positions in education in our country leading. And
Oh,
I was dying. I thought, this is great. I actually
that would be
emailed.
exciting. Yeah.
I know. I emailed
Yeah.
him years ago, probably around
Yeah.
2008, when I first found out about multiple intelligence and asked him some questions. And he wrote back and was
Yeah.
like very responsive. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to have someone who had such a solid understanding of how students learn, making the decisions about education, but that's not just how it works. And we
Definitely.
could
Yeah.
just get bogged down into the politics of it. But I do see a change. I just don't know if it's ever going to be in our lifetime,
Mhm.
of how things have gone since, we were in school now with
Yeah.
social emotional learning in schools now
Definitely.
and
That's one of the major changes, actually. I like the fact that we are discussing much more nowadays, the role of emotions, emotion regulation, self-efficacy, social and emotional learning, because many decades ago, it was not even on the table, I guess, right? Nobody talked about it, right? And that's kind of sad, I think.
I know as I'm looking at my next question for you, so you compare the cognitive sphere to Earth's
Yeah.
conditions to support life, like, and you say the presence of liquid water or breathable air. And I've got a diagram where you've got self, and I just
Yeah.
thought, so do you mean that self-awareness or our motivation, attitudes, beliefs, and emotional and cognitive skills is integral for us, like water and air is to the planet? Is that what you mean with that?
Yeah, I suppose what I mean by, the cognitive sphere being similar to the conditions that are needed for life to thrive on a planet, right? So if you, like you mentioned, oxygen, breathable air and drinkable water and all of that, is that without cognition, there is no learning. And without those conditions, there's no life on the planet. And self, in that case, would be pretty much like the core of the planet. We if we want to look at our students and understand that every student is very different, they have their own ideas of self-identity, for example, self-awareness. And one of the things that I like very much about the SEL competencies with self-awareness and self-management, for example, is that it comes from within. And this is something that, because we normally label students in educational settings, and it's an external agent, let's say us, just telling students what they are, labeling them, and then I think that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy many times. You tell a student that they are this, they cannot reach a certain level, they believe that, and they get stuck. So I feel like self in the illustration of the learning cosmos is really understanding that students are unique individuals, just like planets. Planets are very, very different. If we think about our planet and Jupiter, for example, Jupiter is more than 1,000 times bigger than planet Earth, but most of it is just gas, right? If you think of, and it's massive. And because of Jupiter, we are protected in a way because there's an asteroid belt. And if it were not for Jupiter's gravitational pull, for example, we would be bombarded by asteroids all the time, possibly. And even though Jupiter doesn't have any life, as far as we know, Jupiter has a bunch of moons. I think Jupiter is the planet with the most moons in the solar system. And maybe there's life there. And so there's so much to explore. And then I like this idea of self being the identity of the planet, as it is the identity of our students. And then they have to explore themselves, from within, to understand what triggers, their engagement, and how they respond to certain situations, what kind of emotions they experience when they're going through something, and how far they can go, and how much effort they want to put into accomplishing things, and all of that. And I think that the self is really that, understanding the key characteristics of what makes that planet, or what makes the student, what makes them tick, for example. And I like that because I feel like we have to spend more time understanding the self of our students than just curating content. And because it doesn't really matter if you're trying to teach something to a student that doesn't have certain elements that we have to nurture. Maybe the content will not matter that much, because they will not be able to pay attention, they will not be able to focus, they will not be able to reflect. So then you have to understand the self.
So when you were talking there and you were talking about how important self-awareness, it's actually the most, well, it was until a couple took over, but when I first launched, it was the most downloaded SEL competency. Everyone wanted to know what self-awareness, how do we improve it? But then when you compared it to the Earth's conditions to support life, it's so important, like oxygen and water.
Yeah.
Then I thought about how important nutrition is for our students. It just
Definitely.
hit me while you were talking that it's not just self-awareness, it's now we've got to nourish our students with the proper nutrients before school. What are they getting in the cafeteria at lunch? And then what are we as parents feeding them, after school, to
Definitely.
give them the right conditions?
Yeah, I was teaching a class, I think last week, about the brain. I actually have a brain here, like the
Oh,
right hemisphere of the brain, and
very
and
cool.
I talk about it all the time, the physiology of the brain. And I remember telling my students, and they were in awe, because I said our brains weigh around 1.3, 1.5 kilos or something like that. I'm not sure how much that would be in pounds. And they probably consume most, like probably around 25% of all our calorie intake, so it needs a lot of energy to function, right? So
Right.
that's, like a quarter of all the energy that we have is consumed by the brain. And when people realize that, let's say a student goes to class and they haven't had breakfast or something like that, they cannot pay attention. As simple, it's physiological. If they're hungry, they're working at, let's say, this a subcortical level, right? So when we think about the cortex and the area that processes information, coming from the environment and everything. So you also have the inner areas that we call subcortical areas, and the limbic system is there. And whenever students are hungry, or they feel threatened, or something is wrong, something is they cannot pay attention. They can pay attention effectively, because they first have to meet those needs, because they're very important physiological or even social needs, with connection and all of that, so that they can get to their higher cognitive functions. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So yes, definitely. I think a lot of things we used to think about education, they don't hold true anymore. It's not about going to the classroom and being exposed to content and repeating as many times as possible, but it's really being there with the proper conditions, for you to actually learn. So if you're there and you're starving, if you're experiencing some very, I don't know, you're going through a very tough period in your life, so there's this
Trauma, a lot
emotional
of
state. Yeah,
trauma is big.
trauma, loss, for example, you can't pay attention.
Yep. So everything you're saying here is vast, like the universe. There's a lot to
Yes.
being a teacher in the classroom, just like there's a lot to the universe. So I can see your connections, which I think is brilliant how you made this the
Well, thank
connection.
you. Yeah, like I said, one of the things that I've heard a couple of times is that I have this synthesizing mind. I really like to look at different contributions and try to work out something that combines them in a way that is logical, I think. And with the Learning Cosmos, I definitely felt like, I'm very proud of the article I wrote. Actually, I remember I read it so many times because when I was writing. But a couple of weeks ago, I was having breakfast and I had my Learning Cosmos mug and I got the magazine and I was rereading it. And I felt like, wow, this is a really great article. It was probably the best article I've ever written because the connections, they were there. I saw the connections, I made the connections, and I think it worked really, really well. So I was very proud. I mean, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but it's something that kind of just happened. It was
Yeah.
the connections were made, right?
I know exactly what you mean by that. And it's like it's your life's work seen in a different way.
Yeah,
And now the goal is that you've got to get it out to, maybe help other people expand their thinking in a different way. And then that's when you're making a global impact with what you created. That's really
definitely.
what
Yeah.
we're here for, right? We're here to
Yeah.
help,
I
help
mean,
each other.
there are many things coming out of the Learning Cosmos now. I've been doing some teacher training programs. I've actually created a course about the Learning Cosmos. I'm writing a book about the Learning Cosmos I'm going to explore every sphere. I'm going to give practical examples of how you can tap into the sphere and the learning principles. I might even do something like create an app for teachers who want to explore, like, okay, I want some tips about the cognitive sphere. So you go there, and then there are
Yeah.
tips of how to learn. And so this is something that it's going to be my life's work, I think, because it's going to take a very long time, I guess, for me to get all of those things done.
Which is what I noticed when I was making the questions. I thought there's so many different angles that we could go, often even in conversation. So I feel like we've covered self-awareness really well,
Yeah.
and compared it to the earth and how important it is bringing in all aspects of learning. Could we go to self-regulation next? Um, and
Yeah.
you've got your research on emotional intelligence that was popularized by Daniel Goleman, and then
Yeah.
emotional regulation. And then you talked about Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Yeah.
So could we go there next? What, where does emotion regulation and self-regulation fit in the cosmos?
Yes, that's a very important sphere, the emotional sphere, and also the next one, the attitudes and belief sphere, because it deals with mainly self-efficacy, for example, and understanding how to learn, learning how to learn metacognition. But if you think about self-regulation, an author that comes to mind is Stuart Schenker, for example. I don't quote him there in the Learning Cosmos, but he's part of that. Emotion regulation, the theory of constructed emotion by Lisa Barrett, emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman, because we need, when researchers talk about learning, there's always somebody, we always mention or go through executive functions, right? They're higher functions in the brain. And we normally classify them like we have three main groups or three main categories. And the first one is updating knowledge or working memory, right? The second one is switching or cognitive flexibility. And the third one is inhibiting or inhibitory control. And that has a lot to do with self-regulation, inhibiting distractions and behaviors and reframing behaviors and all of that. And we understand that those things are related to the maturation of our prefrontal cortex. And that takes almost 3 decades of our lives, because we used to think that we were teenagers till 18. We are teenagers still around 27 now, because our brains are not fully matured yet. So if you think about self-regulation, it's such an important skill that will probably, it's a great predictor actually of how successful you will be in life. One of the most referenced tests ever is the Marshmallow Test, right? So we know, we've studied psychology, we know that. And that's a great predictor of how successful those kids will be, because they have to self-regulate. They have to control their impulses, their emotions, so that they can achieve a goal. And I think that's exactly how we have to look at it at a school, an educational setting. We have to not only teach content and skills and things like that, but we have to help our students become better at self-regulation, better users of self-regulation, let's say. So they have to be able to, okay, this is not the time for me to do this. Now I have to focus. Okay, I'm going through a very difficult emotional situation right now, but I have to find a way to control that. You can never suppress that. It doesn't go away, but you can control that. You can't separate cognition and emotion. They're intertwined. But people who are self-efficacious, who can self-regulate effectively, they can kind of put that in the background so that you can achieve your goals, and then you can go home and grieve and mourn and do all of those things, because we need to be functional in society.
There's so many different strategies for each one of the competencies. And then you've put it in a framework to help us to think about really how complex this all is. But I want to keep it simple. And I like how you compare it to, the different conditions on the earth. I'm just thinking about next is our attitudes and beliefs. My next question is attitudes and beliefs. And to me, it kind of goes with the growth mindset. When I was creating those 6 competencies, I added growth mindset because I thought Carol Dweck's work is so important for us to understand.
Most definitely, yeah.
And include. And so then if we could go next to how our attitudes and beliefs about learning, how do they connect to the earth and the cosmos?
Yeah, so I feel that in many educational settings, we have certain beliefs about learning that are outdated. We've been replicating the same old formula, let's say, because we learn that way, our teachers learn that way, their teachers learn that way. And that means that we might have the wrong idea about how learning takes place. One of the ideas we have about learning is that we need that we can take in lots and lots of content, and then that we'll have learned it. It doesn't really happen like that. We need to space out our studies. We have to revisit certain things. So that's one of the things. So we don't know how to study very effectively. We might not know what are the best strategies for us, individually, and even in the classroom with the teachers and the peers and everybody, to study well. And we also have certain attitudes toward learning that are based on how much we believe we can learn. And that has to do with growth mindset, as you said. So Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, the New Psychology of Success, which is a great book, and she published some papers with Jaeger. There's this wonderful author nowadays who kind of touches on growth mindset, Angela Lee Duckworth. She talks about grit, right? And it's a form of growth mindset. So we need to understand that many times our students don't learn effectively because they believe they can't, and for whatever reason, and it might be just in their heads, and they don't even put in the effort that is needed for learning to happen. And if they don't know how much effort they have to put in, how much they already know, their prior knowledge, what are the strategies and resources available to them, they will not learn effectively. And I think that's what we have to do with attitudes and beliefs. We can show our students that there are better ways to learn. There are different strategies. They can get different resources, and they have to believe that they can. It's essential. Otherwise, they will not even start. They won't even try, right? But there are many obstacles there. I think as teachers, as educators, we also have to change our attitudes and beliefs, because many times, because we label somebody, so we say this student will never learn, right? And it's funny that many times, if you could follow up and see where they are 10, 20 years after, they're very successful. They've found something to do, right? And then I remember Jamie Oliver. I'm a big fan of Jamie Oliver's cooking shows, and I have a bunch of cooking books here. And he was dyslexic, so he was diagnosed as a dyslexic kid. Many of his teachers said he's not going to do anything really important in life because he can't. And nowadays he's got so many shows everywhere on TV. He's published so many cooking books, right? He's incredibly successful. He's just, he just had to find his niche, I think. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's all it takes. We have to help our students realize that maybe they will struggle because it's something that they don't like, they're not interested in, but they will find something as long as they keep their minds open and they work really hard, they commit and they make the effort. That's the idea.
Yeah, I remember it was David Souza's How the Brain Learns book. When I was talking to him, I interviewed him twice. In the first interview, I talked about how my youngest daughter was struggling with reading. And then it was 3 years later, I re-interviewed him and I just updated him that it took a while. And he said, yeah, there's no such thing as, can't learn. It's some students are slower learners, and it's having the patience, if you're a teacher or a parent, to sit with them and think about, well, what's happening at the brain level, and give them different ideas, strategies, and resources. So if you were to think about this one, the growth mindset, is there, how can we compare that to the cosmos?
Definitely. I thought of, not just growth mindset, but attitudes and beliefs, for example. I think they are what I like to call our shared knowledge about how things work. And, if we look at the cosmos, for example, how the mechanics of the universe works, basically. So if nowadays there's a very I'd say concerning movement to revise certain things that have been settled for even millennia, like the shape of our planet, for example. So there's a movement in that sense. So a lot of people consider themselves flat earthers nowadays, and because they lack the basic understanding of the mechanics of the universe, and there are cognitive biases at play as well. And when you think about growth mindset, attitudes and beliefs and all of that, it's really understanding and, the basic principles of how learning takes place, I think. So that's what we have to change, I think, from every level, top down, bottom up. If you think about policy making, the politicians believe that learning happens this way. They will make policy addressing that, but that might be the wrong way. Parents who say you should be doing this because this is how you learn, and maybe they don't know how learning takes place because they don't know anything about the science of learning. So, just if you were going to send a rocket or a probe to Mars, as NASA has, very recently, you have to understand physics. There's no way you can make that happen if you don't understand physics. So you have to understand how learning takes place for you to have a growth mindset. You have to understand that the main property of the brain is something we call neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity basically says that, the brain is always making connections, right? We are always making, of course, we lose plasticity with time, but we never lose everything. Our brains are always plastic. There's a decline, of course, with time, with age and everything, which means that we can always learn. This is the basic element of the brain. learning is what the brain does, So like you said, it might take a very long time. It might be very fast, depending on the learner, depending on their effort, depending on their prior knowledge, their access to resources. We have to believe those things. So we if we want to have a growth mindset. And this is really, it's documented. There's so much evidence showing that, right? Just like there's a lot of evidence showing that the planet is actually round, it's a sphere. So yeah.
Well, this is opening up my mind so much. It brought me to a part in your article where you talk about how we've got to design our lessons to allow our students to flourish.
Yes.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Because there's so much here. It seems like I want to make it simple, that understanding all these theories and frameworks and the work that's done in the past can be simple and easy to use as we keep learning and perfecting and making it better for our students.
Yes, this is again very important because sometimes we get our students' attention. They're engaged, they have the right emotional state to learn. They believe the right things about their learning. They are intrinsically motivated, but then we design a lesson that is bad and boring, and then we basically destroy the whole thing that comes before, right? So one of and this quote, when you mentioned that we need to design a learning experience to allow our students to flourish, that comes from one of the greatest educators of all time, in my opinion, and who passed away quite recently, Sir Ken Robinson, who has a wonderful TED Talk, I think one of the most viewed TED Talks. And the title of the TED Talk is Do Schools Kill Creativity, right? And he's published a lot of books. And he says that schools were built on the premise that every student is like a cog or a mechanical device, the assembly line. So it was built on the ideas of industrialization, for example. There's an assembly line and everybody does a little thing, adds a little bit, and then at the end of the assembly line you have the product. Every product is the same, all the units are exactly the same. And that's very far from what really happens in the classroom, because students are not the same thing. They're not a unit of a mechanical whatever product. They are more like a farm and plants. And that's why he says flourish. And I love that verb, because if you plant the seeds of the same plant, and then harvest will come, and then when you actually pick that out from the ground, the soil, every plant will be a little different, because it's organic, it's not mechanical. That's the big difference there. So how can we design better learning environments? I added a couple of things. I think we need to have flexibility. We need to have more learner-centered approaches, or student-centered approaches, that it's not about us and how we deliver content, but it's really how students understand and explore and discover things. Of course, direct instruction also works. We have to do that at some point. Extensive reading also works, but we also have to include desirable difficulties as classified by Robert Bjork. So Robert Bjork is a cognitive psychologist from the US, and I think he worked at UCLA or UC San Diego at some point. And he says that whenever we are teaching, there has to be some difficulty, some challenge, so that the brain can actually learn effectively. And he talks about variation, he talks about testing, interleaving, and retrieving, right? So spacing as well. So if you are not adding difficulty to how you teach your students and how they learn, it's going to be less effective. And I know it's kind of counterintuitive nowadays, because everybody wants the learning experience to be all about fun. And, I think it's very much like going to the gym, right? No pain, no gain. So there has to be a little difficulty there. Otherwise, it's not happening. if you don't feel the lactic acid working on your muscle, then
Not
it's not
doing
working.
anything.
Yeah.
I think it came out in one of my interviews with Douglas Fisher and Nancy Fry. They called it
Yeah.
productive struggle. Uh,
Yeah. There you go.
as we're thinking about this now, can we talk about the macrocosm versus the solar system level?
So when I designed the learning cosmos, I thought of the microcosm, which is basically it refers to the idea of genetics and epigenetics influencing how we learn, pretty much like the realm of quantum mechanics nowadays, because it's the physics of how tiny things work,
Okay.
right? Like atomic, subatomic level. And then we think of the planetary level that includes all of the things we've discussed, cognitive, emotional, attitudes and beliefs and motivational sphere. That's all part of the planetary level because it's really within the surroundings of our students, and our students are the planet in here, right? And then as you move to the learning design arena, like we've discussed, so that's the solar system, sort of. It's the context where the planet is. So inside the classrooms or the learning experience, that's the solar system level, because the interaction with different planets. So the resources you will find in that context will have an influence or an impact on how learning happens, if you think about it. Like I said, Jupiter is protecting us from bombarding, asteroid bombarding. So if Jupiter didn't exist, maybe we wouldn't exist, maybe or maybe life would be very different on this planet. Maybe we wouldn't be locked in this position because of the gravitational influence of all the planets in the solar system counts for us to be here, right? And then as you move away from the solar system, then you get to intergalactic space, right? But basically what I call the macrocosm is from the solar system onwards, because in physics, in astrophysics, macrocosm refers to the idea of what I call the physics of the large. So you look at other planets, the solar system, the space between stars and galaxies, and possibly more, solar systems around those stars. That's what Neil deGrasse Tyson studies, for example, or many other. Stephen Hawking was really interested in that, and this is really further. If we're moving further away from our students now. So the solar system and the other things that will come after, we're moving away from the planet. So then it's not just about the planet anymore. It's about the external forces there that influence the planet. And I feel like this is where we as educators, as teachers, as tutors, we have a lot of say there. It's our arena, because we're moving from the surroundings of the student themselves, right? Their cognition, their emotions, their attitudes and beliefs, and their motivation. And now we're talking about learning design, and that's what we do as educators. We can design our lessons, right? And then of course, after the solar system level, when you get to the intergalactic or interstellar level between stars, then you don't have a lot of say anymore so much, because it's about the school ideology, infrastructure, policy, even the government, right? So maybe, you can pressure certain aspects of that, but again, you don't have a lot of say. So I believe that those external forces are very important, because they kind of, in a way, dictate what we do in the classroom. Think about the syllabus, think about the curriculum that we normally follow in any given educational setting. That's pre-made, we adopt it. It falls on our lap, basically. It's top down. And that dictates what we are going to teach, in many cases, how we are going to teach, and how students are going to be assessed. And that limits our power as educators, as creative people, to actually reach out and help our students learn more effectively. So we have to understand those levels as well.
So while you were talking about those levels, I couldn't stop thinking about the competency of relationships. And
Yes.
and then I thought about systems theory that it just came up actually on one of my recent interviews with Joshua Friedman, and he talked about, the systems theory, and you explain it well. I had never heard of this as a theory before. You bring out every single educational theory I've ever heard of and not heard of in this
Yeah,
article. So
that's good.
yeah, you've got everything in here. It's very thorough. So you talk about that impact, and I couldn't stop thinking about the students in our classroom and all the influences that come before them before they get into the classroom to impact
Yeah.
learning. And then you keep bringing it out as you were talking about the world, as they go out into the world, as they leave their schools. I remember one of the schools I was working at, the students rarely left their area of the
Yeah.
city. And they talked about that, how incredible it was when I would come in and talk about how I had just been on a plane. They're like, "Where did you go?" Because they don't go outside of the square they live
Yeah,
in. So, can you talk about that a little bit? The importance of relationships as we extend our
definitely.
students out into the world.
Yeah, so what I like about the competencies of SEL is that, the two first are more related to the self, pretty much like, the planetary level. So you have self-awareness and self-management, for example. So it's you and yourself, of course, dealing with others, sure, but, how you respond to that within yourself. But then the next ones are more about your community, right? So it's a social awareness and relationship skills and responsible decision making, right?
Oh,
And even envisioning your future self, like what you're going to be like in the future. And I think that's exactly what we need to focus on more. It's building good relationships because and being socially aware of people. Empathy is big there, right? So we want kids who are not only thinking about themselves and I don't want kids to be very competitive all the time, even though we know the world requires a lot of competition, but structured collaboration and even compassion in that sense, because empathy is being able to put yourself in the shoes of others, but compassion is really understanding the other even though you cannot put yourself in their shoes. It's being kind to them, understanding that what they're feeling is something that you couldn't possibly comprehend, but deciding to help them either way, right? It very in a way that relates to Buddhism, I think, being compassionate towards others. And then in when we have relationship skills, we're thinking about teamwork, we're thinking about communication, we're thinking about solving conflict, for example, right? So all of those things are somehow present, I think, in the illustration of the learning cosmos, because you want people to be generous and kind, and you want them to work together well, because this is what we are seeing nowadays, for example, that there's so many bad things happening in the world because people cannot converse anymore. They cannot sit down and have a fruitful dialogue and then solve their differences, which has responsible decision making has ethics, for example, and I think problem solving is part of that as well. Analyzing, and accessing those cognitive skills that are so important for you to be able to build bridges and not burn bridges. So all of those things, they have to be part of our educational system, so that when the kids are trying to imagine what they are going to be like when they grow up, their future selves, they choose to be kind, they choose to be compassionate, they choose to be problem solvers and leaders and great communicators, and people with empathy. There is a theory in psychology called theory of mind.
oh
That
yeah.
is social psychology and cognitive psychology. They discuss a theory of mind, and it's our incredible ability to read other people. And we look at other people, we can tell what they're feeling because of their body language and facial expressions, and even when people are going through a situation, we can actually put ourselves in that situation and imagine what they're going through, right?
Yeah.
So we have to use theory of mind more often, I think, to connect with one another. And I, one of the things we do as educators is, oh, forget about your feelings right now. I have to cover this topic today, because this is going to be on the test.
Right.
And that's really bad, right?
Right. We've probably said that a million times, right?
A million times, yeah. I mean, I understand that we have to, there's a syllabus. I understand, but I think sometimes being supportive and compassionate takes 2 minutes, just listening. So the students are struggling and they want to share something.
Right. So you can see how I created my questions to bring in the SEL competencies. And I think you really covered it well, how you've explained how learning is supported and can compare to the vast universe of the cosmos. And it is vast. And this topic is a powerfully deep one, which is why I wanted to have you on and go through it carefully. Did I miss anything about your article that's important with these questions, how I've asked it?
I think you did a great job, Andrea. I mean, I'm reflecting now. There's always so much to explore, when you think about the learning cosmos. Maybe I can read a passage, a very short one, that I think it was a great passage at the end of the article that goes like this, and I remember thinking about that. And I said, learning is beautifully intricate, and we have only begun our voyage of self-discovery. The implications of our findings will shape generations to come. Our unmatched ability to learn has given us the tools to understand the universe and learning itself. And then I quoted Carl Sagan. He says, somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known. And Albert Einstein, he says, two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. And I think that's it. It's an invitation to explore, and keep learning about learning in ourselves so we can be better people, better educators, better parents, better citizens of the world, right?
Oh, this was good. I've loved every minute of this. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and walking me through your article as it pertains to the cosmos to help us really think about learning and being lifelong learners, and going and reading your article and perhaps mapping it out. How could we improve certain areas of our SEL competencies as we're teaching them to our students? How could we focus in and narrow in? If you had some final thoughts for educators on how they're going to use your article, what would you say?
Well, I say start small, right? I think it's very hard for you to take the cosmos as a whole, because there's so many layers. And if you want to learn how to use the cosmos, the learning cosmos, start from the cognitive sphere, and then there are different principles there. Learn about those principles. I have all of the references in my article. Go to the references, learn about attention, engagement, feedback, and consolidation, and then you move on to the next sphere. Then you learn about emotional intelligence, emotion regulation, and then the theory of constructed emotion, and then you go to the next sphere. It's like I said, I think it's a journey. It's a voyage, into the beautiful and complex space or cosmos that we have out there. There's so much to be discovered. And then, reflect on your practice using the cosmos as the foundation, I think. And then, do I do this? Am I thinking about my students' attention, engagement, consolidation? If I don't, how can I adjust things? How can I take those things into consideration? And then maybe, if you're designing a teacher training program for your school or something like that, go to the cosmos and learn about those theories and principles and implement them, use them to inspire this program of yours, right?
Well, your passion for learning shines through, and you've opened up my mind. I want to thank you so much for taking me on this voyage into the learner's universe for myself and for our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, André. It was an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. To close out this episode, I do have some final thoughts to make Andre's ideas applicable in your life with whatever it is you're working on. I encourage you to download his article and see how you can apply his ideas to whatever it is that you're working on. This interview made me think back to when I asked one of my early influencers a question, something about how he overcomes challenge during difficult times, and his answer was so good that I saved it and I read it from time to time. He referred to the fact that any sort of problem is like a mental challenge that has to be overcome, and he encourages others to look at the macro for the greater good, not the micro. If you have something you're working on and challenges arise, see if you can step back and look at it from another angle. What can you see or learn from this new perspective? This is exactly what André did with his article, as he took us all on a voyage to analyze learning from the macro point of view, where he reminds us just how beautifully intricate learning is, and that we've only just begun our voyage of self-discovery.